A lot of people fled the city when COVID started right away. And I thought, yeah, maybe I'll flee. So I rented a car. And then I realized that I didn't have anywhere to go. So I had to return the car. But I thought maybe I could drive it around first. So I called my friend Cassandra, who had been determined at first to escape to a remote place, possibly with me, but eventually was lured from the frying pan of New York to the fire of Seattle. The outbreak was worse there at the moment, but it's the place she has health insurance, a girlfriend, a puppy, and a cackling parrot that tells her he loves her in her very own voice. "Let's go for a joyride," she replied. So we met outside at midnight. She was wearing a hooded cloak and a dusty medical mask from the 99-cent store. The sidewalks were nearly deserted, but we passed a person here and there, a smoking woman draped over a stoop, a guy lifting weights in a dark playground. The sight of any human gave her a start. Her eyes darted over to them. Her eyes darted over to them. Thank you. As though to ask, "Are you insane? What are you doing out?" And they mirrored her question, which seemed fair since she was every bit the house-leaving renegade they were, not to mention that although her fashion choices were made under the auspices of caution, she looked like the Grim Reaper in surgical drag. Thankfully, no one looked at me. My presentation was plainer, and I always try to move across the pavement like the shadow of a cloud, believing I can attract notice from others exclusively on a subconscious level. Finally, we reached the shiny black evacuation mobile, and we went gliding down Flushing Avenue. Were we the only ones driving in Brooklyn? Reaching the Manhattan Bridge in record time, we crossed over into Chinatown, which was desolate. Little Italy, too. A police car occasionally appeared, but no civilian vehicles. "I wonder what Union Square looks like empty," Cassandra said. So we sailed past the Astor Place Cube with no figures swarming around it, up to empty Union Square. Then empty Madison Square, empty Bryant Park. "Everything's better this way," she whispered, handing me a Cadbury egg. No tourists were streaming in or out of the closed Broadway theaters, but the marquees, bearing enthusiastic adjectives, still loomed. Empty 42nd Street. 2 people were in Times Square, just chilling at the feet of the red staircase, as the usual mania of screens flashed all around. We snaked through empty Columbus Circle, empty Central Park, empty Upper West Side. When cities are empty, they become museums of themselves. Time itself starts roosting on the buildings. We kept cruising, rolling down the windows to hear the sound of no people. Despite the sign on the cemetery gates that we would soon pass in Queens, closed due to inclement weather, the air felt notably mild as it flooded the car in empty Harlem. We were going so fast from one neighborhood to another that the city started feeling like a big gaming board. We could get where we wanted, easy as dragging a figurine across a table, or drawing a pin from a map and piercing a new destination. No one was honking. All the lights were green. That's that piece. I am locked in a room with a microwave, a portrait of Bessie Smith, A cardboard deer head with sticks for antlers and jewels for eyes, heaps of used books, a bed, and various items of food, the labels and outer wrappers of which I have removed for fear of contamination. Tucked into a sideways black crate, these bars of silver, chocolate, stacked copper tins, sardines, and one gold slab, butter, resemble a kind of currency. In my playhouse, this crate is the vaulted hoard of the Federal Reserve. The Fed was a big player this week. It's channeling money into corporations like jolts of electricity to animate the dead. Many among the living, meanwhile, are actually unable to breathe, gripped by a virus that makes them drown from the inside, turns their lungs to frosted glass. Anyone who can stay inside has been instructed to remain inside. Like a goblin chained to its treasures, I was all too eager to withdraw from the outside world, to treat it as a realm to be heard and read about, but no longer viewed with the naked eye, touched or breathed. The virus is sealed out as clouds of information roll in. The themes of this week are air and money, life and death, and exchange. A lieutenant governor from Texas made a splash, for example, by suggesting that old people are willing to die for the sake of the economy. Heady from offering up his own life on national TV, he decided in a go big or go home flight of fancy to simply volunteer his entire generation to the cause, as though everyone over 70 would find satisfaction in dying alone if for the sake of industry, as though all seniors in the land should now be led to their graves by magnetic signal, like sea turtles returning to lay eggs on their island of origin. While some government officials invoked sacrifice, others peddled resurrection. The president originally named Easter as the day stores would reopen, activity would resume, the day normal life would spring back to life. But the crisis has already exposed so much inequity, dysfunction, mania, rot, that many are taking a step back from normal life. They are looking at it like a house they thought they loved, but with the furniture gone, it just looks empty and anonymous, with a ceiling close to falling. I watched the movie Cats and understood almost none of it. I understood only that they were somehow cats, and that they were putting on showbiz numbers as a campaign to be reborn. Right now is like that. There are people, systems, areas of culture. A spotlight is moving over them, and everything is asking for another life. That's that. Thank you. So I did find that in the pandemic, there was so much collapsing that there was simultaneously a strange invitation to dream and to dream about new versions of things, of the world, systems, and also oneself. So I had a long, just a strange journey in my apartment. I started flirting with objects. I started stalking the streets for a cat with a human face I had seen once before. I eventually found it. So things started out good, but I did eventually unravel. I started sinking into the sofa crevice like a spooked creature. Everybody in my life became only a voice on the phone. I felt like I was in an afterlife, a service road running parallel to reality. I found myself celibate and godless, eating quesadillas under a train. Staring out a window I refused to close regardless of the weather. And I started thinking about other people I could be. First, I started being older versions of myself. I started listening to music I used to listen to when I was younger, and then younger still, and as a teenager, then a child. And then I went further back and started listening to music my dad listens to, like medieval choral music, and Baroque choral music, and Renaissance choral music. And there's a whole genre of choral music that is like a whole body of work called Lessons of Darkness. It's a biblical text when Jeremiah is lamenting and asking God why he's forsaken his city. I don't know that much about the Bible. That's why I was going to call, instead of an informal evening with Joseph Keckler, I wanted to call this an infernal evening with Joseph Keckler. But I do like the title, Lesson of Darkness. And so then I thought, well, I'd like to write something called that. And I imagined who I would be to sing it, and I thought, I'll be a man who's older than I am and lives in upstate New York and sings at open mics. So that's this. When some kind of love has been taken away, and you're reminded of it most every day, but some kind of love is away. When for years you're alone, quietly you reside, you hear a voice on the phone, once a riot outside. Alone you reside, and some night you begin to call the devil in. As the mirror bends toward you, you know he can afford you. Well, that's the first lesson of darkness. Just the first lesson of darkness. Someone new comes along to claim you both can be saved, but you know that they're wrong, that your soul won't behave. No, your soul won't behave. Call up your powers, peel back your fears, wallop the hours, steal back the years. What if no power appears, and all that you've got are these magical thoughts? Can you sound some alarm as they too lose their charm? No, it's the first lesson of darkness. Just the first lesson of darkness. It's the first lesson of darkness. Just the first lesson of darkness. That's the first lesson of darkness. There's going to be another civil war, people say these days. These days being the past few years, and especially lately. After a group of police publicly murdered George Floyd for passing a counterfeit 20 in Minneapolis, protests broke out across the nation and beyond it, calling for an end to racist police violence, and if violence is its raison d'etre, an end to the police force itself. After that, we woke up in America to hear about young black people hanging from trees, about a wealthy and barefoot couple bursting out of their mansion to point firearms at passing protesters, to hear about racially charged altercations in parks and parking lots that sometimes culminated in a particularly 21st century standoff of which Susan Sontag might have dreamed. One party aims a phone camera while the other aims a gun, the sublimated weapon versus the real. And as I climbed out my window to sit on the roof all June of 2020, the city sounded like a war zone. Fireworks were going out hour after hour, night after night, and depending on who you asked, they were being set off by trust fund kids, actual kids, anarchists, police, the CIA, or some passing collaboration among two or more groups. But it's not only the origin of the fireworks on which we couldn't agree. We couldn't agree about why we were exploding. Why do we lack a common understanding of what our reality is and the forces that shape it? Are so many Americans caught in feedback loops of perception because most still receive information from one wing or the other of corporate media, both as truthful as funhouse mirrors, simply sitting side by side at the same carnival, bending in different directions, while others lurk on Twitter, where hundreds of users with compressed resumes in their bios spend the day lashing out at one another like a brawl at a trade fair, while others listen to YouTube videos that modestly propose all elected officials are interplanetary shape-shifting lizards, and who among us can prove they're not? I never knew much about the first Civil War. I entered adulthood feeling so ignorant of history. In fact, I once bought a book just called History. My deficiency was my own fault, but it hadn't helped that the public school I went to had no classes in the subject, offering instead the vague social studies, which tilted more social than study. Most days we watched the movie Platoon. The teacher was a merry prankster who once dropped a snowball down one of her favorite students' pants and poked at me with a wooden sword whenever I was asleep, which was always. A couple of years ago, I gathered a little bit more about the Civil War when I stayed in Gettysburg as a guest of the National Park. A luxurious way to learn. Invited as a visiting artist, I was given tours of the grounds so I might cook up ideas for a project. So there I found myself walking through a storeroom filled with bins of cannonballs that looked exactly like gigantic blueberries. And I saw the reconstructed farmhouse of Abraham Bryan, a free black man who left during the war fearing enslavement and returned after to find his house ransacked and his farmland turned into a cemetery. A couple of miles away, I went to Mamie Eisenhower's 1950s house, the walls of which hold a few exuberant portraits by former President Dwight, who painted in retirement when he wasn't out walking the battlefield alone, contemplating military maneuvers. I toured the same battlefield, visiting its grassy expanses, mounds, dips, clusters of boulders. Many of these natural features are named: Big Round Top, Little Round Top, Devil's Den, Plum Run, and the Valley of Death. Also on the grounds are 3 dinosaur footprints, imprinted on stones that now form a bridge. Dating from 200 million years ago, the age of reptiles, these fossils both anchor the landscape in a dramatic time scale and make the Civil War feel current by comparison. Certain trees that were alive during the war still stand today, and some have bullets in them. They are known as witness trees. At one point, I rode shotgun in an SUV, looking out the windows and listening to the park director, who sat behind the wheel leading me on a guided tour, explaining each feature of the landscape as it related to movements, locations, actions of soldiers. I learned that the Southern troops paradoxically entered the battlefield from the north, as the North marched in from the South. I also learned that the Union gathered upon Cemetery Ridge while the Confederates congregated a mile opposite them at the rhyming location of Seminary Ridge. As my outdoor tour approached its end, the park director said that he hoped the site had sparked some ideas for me, but it hadn't. In that moment, I was silently wrestling with doubts about art, which seemed all frills and illusion next to the ravages of war. I might have been reminded that it was a work of art, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, in rendering the brutality of slavery, altered the collective consciousness and partly incited the war. Inside the museum, I saw one of the main attractions, an 1883 cyclorama, longer than a football field, that illustrates rolling hills, wild and tilled fields, soldiers and horses everywhere, lunging and falling among collapsed gun carriages and bursts of smoke, all beneath a placid sky. The event is Pickett's Charge, a failed military maneuver of the Confederacy which led to their downfall. It's regarded as both the climax of the Battle of Gettysburg and the turning point in the war that was to nevertheless blaze on another 2 years. This maneuver is varyingly described online as heroic and desperate, often treated with a mixture of awe and analysis, as though it were a legendary sports play in a late-season game. Towards the end of the afternoon, I strayed from the park, walked to the surrounding town. There I noticed signs and storefronts advertising ghost tours. Like Salem, Gettysburg is a site of historic death that has become a capital of paranormal attraction. In town, I learned that a beloved local who spent 40 years impersonating Abraham Lincoln had recently died. His name was Jim Getty, and it turns out he was a decorated career performer who could call forth Lincoln speeches precisely and spontaneously. The way some people spoke of him, I'd had the idea that he was somehow a professional apparition, a dead president at large, roaming around, muttering the Gettysburg Address. He is survived by at least one town eccentric who has the American psyche on his mind, a young dandy in fur who was holding court in the thrift store. A bawdy poem of Pushkin. Can you imagine such a thing being taught in American schools? He asked the two shopkeepers behind the counter, who returned blank expressions and no answer. I might post it and cause a social media storm, he announced, letting his imagination run away. That will be my trolling. They'll learn all too well what a Russian troll truly is, he continued with increasing verve, as I slipped out and headed back towards the park. In the cabin where I stayed, I tried to imagine what sort of project I could possibly accomplish at this site, what I could say, and if I had anything to say, how I could cut through the layers in the way. An aura of national grief, the dead air of governmental institutions, the sedating fog that had risen out of my social studies textbook and seeped out of certain wall texts in museums I'd just visited. The thrift store's fur-clad schemer might be more up to the task. I still struggle with what it means to dedicate a museum to a civil war, as opposed to a civilization. Does a war museum confine the conflict to the past or carry it to the present? In the cemetery near a honey locust that still grows there, Lincoln himself proclaimed, "We cannot hallow this ground," and called upon the living to take on an increased commitment to the cause, so that the dead should not have died in vain. But what of all the diagrams I had seen, the elaborate play-by-plays of how the North and South collided in the war over slavery? Why such focus not on the stakes of the war and its outcome, but on the positioning of soldiers during the bloody encounter? I thought of the subculture of people who perform reenactments, donning old military garb, impersonating the generals. Could the perennial interest in the details of the violent scene be driven by the vigilance Lincoln envisioned, an ever-renewing commitment to human rights? That's one idea. Yet a Civil War reenactment is not the sort of annual pageant that repeats the founding myth of a religion or nation. Instead, it's one that calls up a question at the nation's heart. It occurred to me then that the walls of the museum, the staging on the battlefield, the endless mappings of the conflict, the persistent obsession with the geometry of the field, the choreography of the battle, were also studies in possibility. Consciously or unconsciously, possibility itself has been kept as a fossil, hard and definite as the prints of the dinosaur, as though in a subterranean reality, the war were always happening, as though the other side still had a chance to win, as though secretly it had.